WNYC Studios is supported by Grubhub. Sometimes getting to a so-called convenience store isn't actually very convenient. But now Grubhub delivers from local convenience stores. Whether you're in the market for snacks, paper towels, or drinks, Grubhub delivers them right from the convenience store to your door.
The Takeaway is supported by Progressive. Are you thinking more about how to tighten up your budget these days? Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average, and customers can qualify for an average of 6 discounts when they sign up. A little off your rate each month goes a long way. Get a quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts vary and are not available in all states and situations.
This is The Takeaway with Melissa Harris Perry.
Now, many world leaders, including President Biden, have accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of violating international law with this invasion of Ukraine. And they've used that violation as justification for the economic sanctions imposed on Russia. But considering that Putin has shown no sign of easing on his military aggression, it appears that so far these repercussions have had little effect on his decisions. For more on this, I'm joined now by Ingrid Wirth, professor and associate dean at Vanderbilt Law School and incoming co-editor-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law. Thanks for joining us, Professor Wirth.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with just maybe a basic understanding here of international law. Based on what you've seen, are we in a situation that Russia has in fact violated what we would think of as a permissible reason for launching this kind of attack?
Absolutely. International law, including the Charter of the United Nations, prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity of another country. And that is absolutely what has happened here with the war in Ukraine. There are some exceptions, for example, for self-defense, but it is clear that the preconditions for self-defense were not met here. So Russia is absolutely in violation of international law.
Now, once an armed conflict is underway, what does international law tell us about civilians and how they're supposed to be treated in these moments?
There are two different bodies of international law at work here. One body regulates when a country can actually use force at all. And then the second body of international law governs how you use force. And that second body of law, for example, prohibits the use of certain kinds of weapons. And as your question suggests, it also requires that civilians and other non-combatants be protected from the hazards of armed conflict. So, for example, Russia has to distinguish at all times between combatants and civilians may never be the deliberate target of attacks. The same rules apply to Ukraine.
So clearly, for many, hearing that raises questions about actions of the United States and other Western nations in decisions that have been made over the course of the past 2 to 3 decades. And in fact, actually, we've recently heard that for the U.S. to make a claim like this against Russia is to not account for our own military actions in places, for example, like Iraq. Can you help us to understand sort of the validity of that argument?
Absolutely. I think it's a very important argument. And Russia has been very careful to defend its actions in Ukraine as consistent with international law. And it has cited what it views as similar actions taken by the United States. And so let's take the war in Iraq as an example. This was a US-led war that led to probably, around 500,000 deaths. And the United States said that the war was legal for a couple of different reasons, but self-defense was primary among them. We were defending ourselves from potential weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And, the factual predicate there turned out to not be accurate. Russia is relying on self-defense in its actions in Ukraine. It says that NATO is getting too close to Russia and it fears an attack from Ukraine. So I don't think we should equate these actions morally in any way, but I do think the United States' actions in Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East have weakened the international law prohibitions on the use of force.
So help me to understand that a bit, the notion of the strength or weakness of international law. I understand in a domestic context how once laws are on the books, we enforce them, sort of who the agents of that enforcement are and what the penalties are for violating them. How does that work in a global context?
So the United Nations Security Council is able to enforce many norms of international law. The United States is a veto-wielding member of the United Nations Security Council, and so is Russia. And so, for example, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, it was immediately subjected to sanctions by the United Nations Security Council, as, if you will, as a punishment. Those aren't available to sanction either the United States or Russia or any of the other members of the permanent members of the Security Council. But what we do see in this situation and many others is a very large set of decentralized enforcement mechanisms. So Russia has suffered a great deal in terms of economic sanctions. We will see how effective those are, but there have been very significant consequences for this violation of international law.
One of the ways that international law is sometimes discussed is around this question of red lines. Certainly during the Obama administration, the question of the red line of chemical weapons use, for example, in Syria. And yet sometimes these red lines do permit and allow, and we see, in fact, military intervention. At other times, even crossing the red line does not, in fact, lead to military intervention by the international community. I'm wondering whether or not these kinds of ultimatums are valuable, or whether or not they, again, by not enforcing them, we weaken, haven't ever set them.
That's a very interesting strategic question. And as you point out, I don't think the red line that President Obama drew in Syria with respect to chemical weapons, I don't think that worked out well. If you're going to draw a red line, you need to be extremely clear about what the consequences will be. And if you think about it in the Russia situation, the West is going to react to the extent possible collectively. And so I think it's very hard to make a collective decision ahead of time as to exactly what the consequences will be. And furthermore, if you draw a red line, suppose we drew a red line with respect to NATO countries. What would that be saying about actions that fall short of the red line? Right? What if Putin moved on and invaded Sweden? Well, Sweden's not a part of NATO, right? So whenever you draw a red line, you raise questions about what about things that approach the red line, and then what are the consequences you're actually going to impose if the red line is crossed? And I think it's hard for countries to agree about that ahead of time, and it's also hard strategically to make those consequences clear ahead of time. So I think they're very hard to use.
Do you have a sense of what international law looks like on the other side of this particular invasion and conflict?
It depends a lot on actually what happens. We're very early on in this conflict. You may see a more robust version of international law emerging with Western countries recommitting to the prohibition on the use of force, or you could see a further fraying of international legal norms against territorial conquest and territorial integrity. I think it's too early to know. It's very gratifying to see a unified Europe, and it's very gratifying to see a largely unified West in response to these actions. So we might see a more robust international law emerging.
Ingrid Wirth is a professor and associate dean at Vanderbilt Law School and the incoming co-editor-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, an honest conversation about returning to the office.
Forced communal lunches, or the strongly suggested communal lunch, open floor plan. Coming back to work is partially about surveillance and micromanagement, and people of color feel that in a different way. Everybody feels it, but people of color feel it in a different way.
That's the New Yorker Radio Hour from WNYC Studios. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.